And welcome back to Moving Conversations. I'm Brian Ritchie. Joining me as always is Nora St. John. Good morning, Nora. How are you today?
Well, Brian, how are you?
Doing good, doing good. I'm excited about today's topic. It's something that you said that when you were let's do a little backstory. You and I
Okay.
recorded something for the advanced movement principles
Yep.
on the pathology. And today's topic is the ACL, anterior cruciate ligament. And you said that we talked at least for about an hour when we recorded that. So we have a lot to say on the subject, I think.
We have a lot to say on it, and it's a not uncommon injury, and it's a not uncommon injury. This is at the knee, guys. If your anterior cruciate ligament is in our knees, and it's one that really causes a lot of trouble, right? So whether you
Yeah.
repair it or you don't repair it, and how long it takes to recover after you do repair it, like it's a thing. If any of you have had an ACL repair or an ACL tear, like this affects your life in a major way. So we wanted to just dive into it a bit.
Yeah, so we're doing a little deeper dive. We talked about knees in the past, so today we're going to do the deeper dive into the ACL. I do want to tell you before we get into that, though, please do me a favor, hit the like, the subscribe, whatever the button is on the social media of your choice. Hit and say you like us. And do us a favor, even comment. The more comments we get, it pushes us up even further into people's feeds, and we'd really appreciate that. You can always get in touch with us on our Gmail account, Moving Convos, with us with an S, movingconvos@gmail.com. It's the best way to get in touch with us. But we are on pretty much all of the social media things, but we're really doing a lot with Instagram, and we have been doing a lot more video work. If you've been following us, you've seen our Anatominis have been launching every week, and we've had a lot of fun doing that. And we're going to be recording a lot more in the future. So keep your eyes open for that. And yeah, and anytime you have any questions, comments, anything you want to talk to us about, hit us up at movingcombos@gmail.com. All right, we got
All
that
right.
behind us. Now
All right.
let's
We're ready.
let's jump into the ACL, the anterior cruciate ligament.
All right. So let's talk a little bit about where it is and what it does.
Yeah.
So inside your knee, right, you've got your femur coming down from the top, you got your tibia coming up from the bottom, and you have to connect those 2 points because right now they're kind of like, I always think of the end of the femur as being just 2 wheels, and then the end of the top of the tibia as being kind of just a platform that those wheels roll on. So there's
Yep.
not a lot of inherent stability in that joint, just to start with. So what holds it together, aside from muscular strength, which is a major stabilizer, is ligaments. And Brian,
Mhm.
what are ligaments?
Well, ligaments are a connective tissue that connects bone to bone, primarily bone to
Mhm.
bone.
Yep.
And there's a lot of elastin and collagen in them. They are normally avascular. They don't have blood flow for the most part. There are a few exceptions to the rule, but for the most part, they're avascular, and they are there to provide stability. All joints in the human body love to be stable. That's what puts it in the path of motion that it was designed for. So we want to have that stabilization. And in the knee joint, if you think about it, we think of it as a relatively stable joint because it's just a modified hinge joint. There's a little bit of rotation that occurs when the knee is bent. But in a straight knee position, what's really stabilizing that at rest are ligaments. You
Absolutely.
know?
So one thing I think about ligaments, and this is just an example, so I'm going to use this as an analogy. Ligaments are like they're range limiters. So, for example, like if you think
Yep.
about a dog on a leash, not a retractable, stretchy leash, but a regular old, like, leather leash or whatever it is, right? When that dog is close to you and it's just going around, there's no tension on the leash. But as soon as the dog, you know, sees a squirrel, for example, and lunges, they come to the end of their leash. And that's a lot of what the
Free?
ligaments do. Right, exactly. And I'm stopping. Is the ligaments are again when they're not under stress, they're slack, right? There's a little bit of they're not moving. And then when you go to an end range, some of them, depending on which angle you're going to an end range at, tighten up to keep you from going too far. So
Yep.
just like that dog leash, holding you together.
And I love the what you said about it being the leather leash, because
Mhm.
ligaments have a little bit of give, much like leather does. There's a little bit of inherent give. We don't want a lot. Too much give makes it an
Right.
unstable joint. They say within the
Yep.
ACL, if it loses more than a millimeter or two of give, then you've really lost the inherent stability there.
Right.
But That's a lot like leather. Leather, it'll have just a tad of give and then it snaps right back.
Right,
Unfortunately, with ligaments, we've talked about this in our sprains and strains podcast back from, I think, February, where if you repeatedly sprain something, the chances of it not returning back to its original length become greater and greater. And that can happen
right.
with the ACL like any other ligament.
The other thing too, just about ligaments is, they, like every other part of the body, they develop as we develop. So, for
Mhm.
example, if you're a pitcher or you're a tennis player or you're a dancer and you start doing a lot of high level range of motion work early on in your life, like as you know, teenager, whatever, you will increase the range. So you'll actually stretch out those ligaments to accommodate to those movements. If you've ever watched a baseball pitcher or a tennis
Yeah.
player doing a serve, how far that shoulder is behind them in lateral
Yep.
rotation, it is like unbelievable. And that's because they've trained those ligaments to be extra loose in that direction. Same thing with a dancer who has a lot of hip extension. A
Yep.
lot of times you've trained that. So ligaments will accommodate to the tasks that you give it when you're young. Once you reach adulthood, they pretty much stay where they are unless there's a trauma to them, right? And the
Yeah.
trauma can be minor, can be a few fibers that tear, which means you just lose a little stability, or it can be, a complete rupture, as we talked about in our sprains and strains.
And when you talk about the stretching of ligaments, talk about Tommy John surgery, the ulnar
Hmm.
collateral ligament that occurs because they have stretched it out so much in that pitching motion over the years, over and over and over, that there eventually gets to be a point where it's no longer stable. And you talk to a
Right.
pitcher who has that, and they still have strength. They can still throw 95-mile-an-hour fastball, but they don't always know where it's going. They don't have the same amount
Oh,
of control.
the
That's
proprioception is lost.
yeah, that
Ah.
stability is lost
Mm.
a little bit. So they may be fine for the most part, but then they start getting out of control
Mm.
and they realize that that's what's going to happen. And again, it just keeps stretching and stretching and stretching to the point where it is an unstable joint and they have to go and basically shorten it up a little bit.
Aha. So with ACL, it specifically goes from the femur to the tibia inside the joint.
Yep.
And it's called the anterior cruciate ligament because it keeps the tibia from sliding forward on the femur,
Hmm.
right? So it goes from kind of if you think about the back of the femur to the front of the tibia. And it's much smaller than that, but basically that's the angle of it. And cruciate means cross or X. Ooh, Brian's got a model. Excellent.
So for those of you watching on YouTube, we can sort of see where the cruciate ligaments are within the knee joint, but what we're really trying to provide is we don't want to see that tibia slide
Right.
forward in the joint to create instability, to create that instability.
The test for an anterocruciate ligament tear or instability is what's called the anterior drawer test, which kind of cracks me up.
Mhm.
They basically take the tibia and see if they can push it forward in front of the femur. And
They
right,
literally grab it and pull it
yep,
forward,
yep,
and if it moves, to a significant degree, and if you've ever seen it happen, you will
ah,
see. Right now, this is very stable. When it's not, this thing will come all the way out to here. It comes a lot farther than you would ever think.
yep. So that's basically what it does, and it's responsible for something like 85% of the stability of the knee.
A
Is that right? I think
Anywhere from
I know,
83 83 to 88%.
yeah, you're throwing out some numbers there, I know, when we did our previous session on this. So it
Yep.
is critical to that stability, right? There's a posterior cruciate ligament, and there's ligaments also on either side of the knee, the medial and lateral collateral ligaments, but those are not as crucial. The ACL is the crucial ligament for stability of the knee.
Yeah, and that 88%, like I say, 83 to 88% is in a straight knee position. That's when
Aha.
you have the greatest amount of stability because in a straight knee position, again, I'm going to the model so you guys can see this on YouTube. Okay. You also have the lateral and medial collateral ligament. In a straight knee position, they're all helping, including the posterior
Mhm.
collateral ligament. Everything's helping. But as soon as we bend that knee, our lateral and medial collateral ligaments go slack. They
Yeah,
begin
they
to
lose
loosen up.
tension.
They
Yep.
lose tension, which is why we have a little bit of rotation when we bend the knee and why we often see injuries to the ACL when there's a slight bend in the knee because it
Mhm.
loosens the whole joint. And then if
Mhm.
there's a blow or a twist, a rotary force, that's when
Yep.
we see that pop.
Yep. So, for example, the classic ones on that are your foot is in a sticky shoe, you're on the basketball court, and you go to make a quick left turn, and your foot stays there, and your torso
Yep.
goes left, and the knee is stuck between those, right? Another
Yep.
classic is skiing, where your foot is
Oh yeah.
attached to, the boot is stuck into that ski or that snowboard, and the rest of you is going in a different direction. So
Yep.
anything where you get, again, that rotary force is classic, or in football, getting hit, right? Getting hit in a certain angle on the knee when it's bent, which also happens a bit in that sport.
What we also see is with females, you're going to see just in general, teenage females, soccer players, almost almost every single person I've trained as an adult who played soccer as a teenager has had an ACL tear. I mean, I'd say
Mm,
like 90% of the people that I've seen in
wow.
when they were a teenager. And there's a lot of reasons for that. There's a lot of theories of, weak gluteomedius muscle, things like that. But you also have to figure their Q angle. They're still maturing. They have a large Q angle between, where the hips are versus the knee.
They
It
might be a
almost
little
looks
more
like they're
knock-kneed,
knock-kneed.
right?
Yep,
That's
they're
kind
more
of where the
knock-kneed.
Q angle goes. Yep, a little less straight angle of the joint from the hip to the knee.
But you also have to look at the stabilizing muscles, okay? The stabilizing muscles around the knee and the hip. When you're playing on a field, and oftentimes, I hate to say this, but with female athletics, at least in the past, you're not playing on the best field. Your foot might get
Uh-huh.
stuck in a
Right.
rut.
Yep.
The field isn't like turf that it's perfect. So if your foot gets stuck in something and you twist around it, but your foot stays still, that rotary force, because you're cutting, pivoting, twisting, turning, that's what's going to cause that enough rotary force. And again, you don't have the same amount of stability and strength necessary to withstand that repeatedly. So eventually, one time, it's going to say, "Okay, I've had enough. This is done," and that's when it'll go. It'll be that sort of straw that broke the camel's back, but also right place, right time,
Right
right
time.
movement, and guess
Yep.
what?
Boom. The other thing
Exactly.
too, there's also been a much higher incidence of ACL tears, sprains, et cetera, in female athletes generally. And there's also a hormonal component, which there's some debate about, but women just in our natural cycle have different amounts of different female hormones as we go through our cycle every month. And one of those hormones is relaxin, which is basically what's necessary at the late stage of pregnancy to loosen all the ligaments and soften them all around the pelvis so the babies can come out. And that cycles through even at a small level every month. So there seem to be periods of time during each month when our ligaments are a little bit different in tone. And I think that instability or that inconsistency, at least that's what they're hypothesizing, is part of why female athletes are more prone to injuries, particularly of the ACL.
Interesting. Interesting. Yeah, my thought always went back to, I mean, you were a dancer, so you had, training very specific to what you wanted to do. You talk to a lot of female athletes, and they usually don't work with an athletic trainer in high school. Normally, the
No.
athletic trainer and whatnot are working with the men's team. The women's
Yep.
team is kind of like, well, there's the weight room, go for it.
Or
Do you want
go
to lift
run.
weights?
Right.
Go
Or go
run.
do that. Go figure stuff out.
Right. Or
Yeah.
you just train at
Yeah.
your sport.
Right.
And that's another thing. You're not really training for what we talked about last week, resiliency of the tissues. You're not really
Yep.
training for that strength and stability to help from the musculature. So
And
that's been a big theory that's been around for a while too.
yeah, and even with that being said, when I think about a lot of what people think personal training should be or working in the weight room should be, they think about sagittal, bilateral work. Like they don't always
Yeah.
think about, and if you think about a soccer player, in particular, a basketball player or a football player, anybody who's running around a field, they have to have stability in that knee laterally, medially, on the diagonal, front, back. Like
Oh yeah.
those forces can come any way through it. And a lot of like, if I think about an uneducated person going into a weight room or somebody who's just kind of watched something on YouTube or talked to their friends about what they should be doing, they might be doing squats and lunges, which is great. They might
Yep.
be doing some other things, but they may not be really working on all those other angles that they need to get strong and stable because, you're going to
True.
be lunging out to the right with a bent leg in external rotation, in abduction, whatever is happening. So,
Yeah.
again, thinking about just how people um, need some guidance about what they need to be able to manage their sport.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. The the makeup of the ACL I've always found interesting because of the knee structure. You look at all of them besides the LCL, besides the lateral collateral ligament, which is the thinnest. It's the smallest. It's also gets a lot of help from the IT band, so it's not really a
Yeah.
structure that needs a ton of support.
Yeah.
But the ACL is fairly thick on the ends, you know, but its width is only about 10 millimeters. But the center of it, it actually looks like an hourglass. It actually comes because it has to go through a narrow joint, you know,
Hmm.
in the knee. So it
And
actually
stay out of the
narrows
way.
out and then widens out again. So in the
Mm.
attachment sites, it's actually fairly wide in comparison to the center, which I've seen data that says it narrows anywhere from 8 millimeters from 10 all the way down to 6 millimeters from 10 millimeters. And I'm
Mhm.
sure there's a lot of variability depending on the person. That's just natural. But when you see that, you see, oh, that gives it a point at which if I'm going to break anywhere, guess what? That's that spot. That's where it's going to happen.
It's not gonna be at the attachments. It's gonna be in the middle.
Right.
Yeah, which,
Right.
yeah, makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and it's made up of wavy bands of collagen in various directions. So there is some structure to it that gives it strength in various directions. But still, having that narrow portion really gives it that place of, you know, the weakest link in that chain.
Vulnerability. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you can see
Yeah.
how, you think about winding up just like your belt or something, just winding that up and twisting that, right? If the narrow spot is in the middle of that and you twist it, that's gonna be the more likely to cause trouble there.
Well, anytime you've
So
had a rubber band and you've pulled
yeah,
it, and it's been
yeah,
stretched, you'll see that there's one area that often will sort of narrow out. Well, that's
yeah,
similarly what's happening.
that's that's the deal. So with ACLs, a couple things. So one is, prevention. We're just talked briefly about that. Just making sure that that knee is trained to manage forces coming from all different directions and all different ways. So that's something. But let's say somebody does get an ACL tear, and let's talk first about just a partial tear. So there's some
Okay.
instability. They may or may not repair it. So you may just have some instability in that knee that you're working with.
Yep.
I know, I don't know about you, but many clients, I've had a lot of clients with ACL tears, and a partial one gives them a lack of confidence in that knee. So it'll often mean that they stop doing as much. They're not sure when it's going to go out. It will just kind of like, you know, shake side to side or lose stability unexpectedly in different moments. And it takes actually a lot of strength and a lot of work to really stabilize a torn ACL. Has been my experience of it. And if a
Mhm.
client's not willing to do that, they're not willing to have, they're not likely to have as good an outcome as somebody who's willing to do some more work if there is a tear.
Yeah, you need the help. You
You
definitely
need the
need
help.
the muscular support. A
Yes.
partial tear, and I've heard this from a number of physicians, you can have a partial tear and it can never bother you again because you're
Right.
literally just snipping off part of it, much like we talked about leather. If you have a leather band that's 2 inches
Right.
wide, well, you can cut an inch of that and it's still going to have some strength, not the same strength as it did before, but it's going to have some strength. However, it also gives it a point of either even further vulnerability because
Right.
it's already been torn to a certain degree that if it's going to go, that's going to be the point at which it's going to happen. And I find it's more a lack of confidence with these people than anything
Mhm.
else because the doctor's been has told them, "Ooh, you better take it easy on this now because it could just go at any time." And I think there's a fear of that much more so than even a feeling of it. I think it's just a fear of, "Oh, I don't wanna push this too much."
Right, I got a vulnerable spot. I think it's both. I mean, I've seen both for sure.
Sure.
Um, so so with that in mind, like a lot of times what I'm working with a client like that is strength, 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 strength. And
Absolutely.
specifically, I do a lot of work on hamstrings. Like usually I
Mhm.
think hamstring to quad is roughly 70% quad, 30% hamstring-ish. Okay, just there's a big ish on that one, a lot of different ways that people talk about that. But the quads are generally supposed to be stronger than the hamstrings as a general
Yep.
rule. But in this case, the hamstrings, if you think about how they attach to the back of that tibia, they're going to be what keeps that tibia from sliding forward, right?
Yes.
And when they fire, when they activate, is what's going to create that stability to keep that tibia under the femur. So I do a lot of hamstring work, more than I would, way more than I would do with an ordinary client, trying to really get that strength up to almost 50-50 if I can.
Yeah, and for me, I look at it ratio wise. If I
Uh-huh.
before was doing quadricep versus hamstring exercises, there might be 2 to 1 favoring quadricep,
Yep.
but again, we're doing a lot of, compound movement, so we're getting some
Both are
hamstring, but we're
working.
mainly getting
Absolutely. Both are
both are
working.
working.
Yeah.
But people forget the hamstrings are a two joint muscle. So if I'm doing a squat, my hamstrings are definitely working, but I'm going to feel them up higher. They're going to affect higher up. You're not going to feel it behind the knee nearly as much. You are strengthening the whole muscle, but it's not the same as necessarily like a hamstring curl where you're going to be
Exactly.
bringing that tibia toward the hip. And I
Yep.
find that's really what needs to happen in your rehabilitation. And I'll do a 2 to 1 ratio. I'll flip it and start doing 2 hamstring exercises to 1 quadricep exercise. And that way I know that I'm working enough because we've all been there. You go to the gym, you give yourself a certain amount of time, and you're going to do the big exercises first. And then, oh, I don't have time to do that one.
And
Well,
the 3
guess what?
things you like to do. Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And no one likes to work their hamstrings. Let's face it, they are
Mostly
not a
not.
fun they're not fun, except for bridges, which are fairly easy for most people. Hamstring curls of all varieties, man, they're gonna burn, they hurt. Uh, and
You
when I
feel
say hurt,
weak.
they just don't feel good. You feel weak, you don't do
You
nearly
feel
as much
weak. It's not
weight.
satisfying. Yeah.
No, no.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I'll do that. I'll up that to a 2 to 1 ratio and try and bolster that support because again, you wanna make sure that that tibia doesn't wanna translate anteriorly, so you're gonna do everything you can on the backside to pull that tibia backwards.
So a couple of things that I work on specifically in the Pilates studio, which is kind of a nice place to work on some of the ACL stuff, is one is if you're on a reformer and you're doing footwork, right? You push out and then you just let the carriage bring you back in. One thing I work on to get the hamstrings more active is sometimes I'll put a light weight on, and sometimes I will just say, okay, so push out, pull yourself back in.
Yep.
And this is where, if you've ever worked on a classical machine or a Gratz machine or a contrology machine, that stickiness of the wheels means you have to pull yourself in. And I find that that's really where you can get some of that real feeling behind the knee. Like you can actually feel some of that lower fibers of the hamstring, which is really nice there. And that's like just a nice, easy way exercise you're going to do anyway, but it could just help to get those hamstrings a little more involved. Because a lot of times,
Mhm.
if I'm palpating somebody's hamstrings in footwork on the reformer, there could be nothing happening there. Like it could be really like just squish. So that's just kind of a way, again, just even in a simple exercise to start to get that activity going.
Yeah, I love that. On the reformer, the other thing I like is putting a lighter resistance and just having them do bridges
Yes,
because
and
with the lighter
hold it in.
resistance and hold it, don't let the
Hold the
carriage move.
carriage. Yep, hold the carriage in.
Because that hamstring, oh my gosh, I've taken some of my big athletes and put them on that and put a fairly light resistance on there. And they're looking at me like, oh, we're going to play with this machine. Okay. And they go up and the carriage moves. I said, don't move. Don't move. And it frustrates the heck out of them. They're trying to grab on with their
Yes,
hands. They're doing
exactly.
anything they can, but it gets that hamstring really firing. And then at the top, at the end, when I've done 8, 10, whatever, however many repetitions I'm going to do, I will actually have them push out while they're in a bridge and
Yeah,
then curl themselves back in with their hips
yeah,
up higher.
exactly.
Oh man, you talk about a hamstring burner,
Yep.
but it really targets those hamstrings. And in a general gym sense, I mean, we've got tons of hamstring, machines. You've got your seated hamstring curls, excuse me, prone hamstring curls,
Yep.
standing. You have all sorts of options that you can do that way. One of my favorites that we do here a lot is I have a mechanic stool. You can get these. I
Mhm.
used to get them from Sears when there were
The
Sears.
rollers, right? The little rolly
The rollers.
stools. Yeah.
Yeah, and they're low to the ground because
Yep.
an office chair is a little too high. They're
Yep.
low to the ground, so you have a lot of deep hip flexion, and I just have them walk up and down the hallway. And the first time they do it, they're like, "Oh, this is way too easy." And then they turn around and they start coming back. Oh my gosh, is this
Sitting
uphill? Is
right,
there
so sitting on the stool and basically pulling themselves forward with their feet, right?
right?
That's
And
yeah,
it
yeah, yeah.
works great. They hate it, but they all know they need it. And it's an
Yep.
easy exercise for them to do,
Yeah.
and it doesn't take much mind work and it's not like they're gonna cheat on it. They gotta walk, they gotta do it, they gotta
Right.
finish.
Yeah.
So that's one that I like to do because it's an easy exercise and it's so beneficial. And it's really
Awesome.
targeting the lower end of the hamstring. And again,
Mhm.
I don't like to say upper and lower for abs and all that kind of stuff, but you feel it more because you're really affecting the lower portion. You're doing that knee bend. It's not like a stiff-legged deadlift where you're just primarily using your hip portion of the hamstring to where you're going to feel that work as much. This you're going to feel right behind the knee, and you are promoting that knee bend.
Right, well, think about it. I mean, if you're in that position or other things that you're stabilizing the hamstring at the top end on that one, right? Because
Yep.
you're not really changing the angle at where it attaches onto your sit bone, but you're really
Yep.
using the lever. So stabilizing there, using the bottom half. If I'm doing
Yep.
something more like a prone leg lift or something like that, it's a very
Yep.
different feeling. There, I'm really working on the top part. I'm stabilizing the bottom part because I'm not moving my knee if it's a straight leg
Right.
lift, and I'm really using more of that top attachment. So that can
Yep.
really vary where you're working for sure.
Yeah. And how it feels.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
And I've worked with people for so many years, and rarely have I ever heard someone say they feel their hamstring burn during lunges or even stiff-legged
No.
deadlifts. They
No,
never feel
no.
it there.
Uh-uh.
But during any type of knee bend, any type of hamstring curl or
Yep. It's killer.
hallway walks, we call, oh my gosh, they feel it like crazy. So
Yep.
those are the ones I try to do for this particular reason.
Right, exactly, to get that lower feeling and get that knee activity happening, the hamstring activity happening at the knee, and the bent knee is where you want the stability, right?
Yep.
Because to your point, when the leg is straight, it's relatively stable, and when it's bent, that's when the other ligaments go slack, and you have to work on the stability. So doing it from a bent knee position makes a lot of sense.
And even that hallway walk, you can affect a little bit of what part of the hamstring you're working on depending on your foot positioning.
Yep,
Because if you want to work more of the lateral side, you turn your toe out a little bit. The medial side,
yep,
you turn your toe in a little bit. Because you have such a large amount of knee bend, you actually can do that. You can
yep.
do a little bit of external or internal rotation and focus a little bit more. And I find that most people, the medial heads are a little bit weaker than the lateral head,
Generally. Yep,
generally.
unless somebody's
Now, all
really
of
trained in.
these yeah. Now, all of these exercises are not just for partial tears, because
Yes.
we're gonna talk now about not only a full tear, but we're gonna talk about surgery and non-surgical,
Yep,
because we've both worked with clients who have had an ACL tear but never repaired.
yep. And Brian, you said something, so let's bring this right up. So you said you'd been reading
Okay?
some research
Yes.
about right? About
Yep.
actually ACLs repairing themselves, which is the first I'd heard about it. So that was kind of an
It's
interesting.
It's the first I'd heard about it. Medscape sent out something. This literally just came out May 14th, and it came out of Vienna. So I'm going to read directly from this. Nearly one-third of anterior cruciate ligament injuries appear to heal without surgery, according to the analysis of a three-dimensional MRI taken. And this was at an event, the World Congress on Osteoarthritis 2024's annual meeting. Uh, 2 years after injury, the MRI was done and showed that 13 of 43, so approximately 30% of the knees that had evidence of had evidence of those normal continuous ACL fibers. Okay, so they had begun to grow back. Those
Now,
fibers began to grow back.
where was it a complete rupture? Because that doesn't say that it was a complete rupture there. To say that somewhere
Yeah,
else. Okay.
they're talking about complete ruptures, but
Okay.
again, this is early stages of this research. This is very early stages of this research. So again, I want to see. We talked about this in when we did reading research back in May. We talked about this, and I want to see a lot more. But they did say that with a complete rupture, that a percentage, about 30 to 33%, with just rehabilitation alone, were uh, were regrown, or they
That's
did those
interesting.
2
Yeah,
ends did
fascinating.
begin to come back together.
Yeah. Yeah,
So,
yeah.
there's a lot of variables, there's a lot of factors into it. I can put the I haven't been able to get my hands on the full study, which is the only thing that I wanted to mention this here, that this might be true. This is something that just came out. So it might. I want to read the entire article before I say, oh, this is definite or not. So just know that this was just released, a couple of weeks ago.
Right.
So, but it does say, it does sort of point to the fact that there's a possibility because I've worked with a number of clients who have had full tears.
Mhm.
And let's say they had full tear 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And they felt unstable for a while. And by the time I get to them, they're saying, "Oh yeah, no, I do everything. Nothing bothers it." And they're doing things like cutting, pivoting, twisting, turning. They're running. They're doing weird angles and things. And I'm
Mm,
thinking, you shouldn't be able to do this on an unstable knee, not without an ACL. It just doesn't
mm,
make sense. And when I've
mm.
done a anterior drawer test, there's a little bit of slack, but it's not like I would have expected for someone who doesn't have an ACL. Now, I'm not saying that they
Right.
regrew it. I'm just saying that stability wise, they had more stability than I expected them to have based on an anterior cruciate ligament rupture.
Right. Right, right,
So
right.
again, there's a lot more research that needs to be done on this, but it does point to the fact that it's a possibility that things are more than what we knew them to be years past.
Yeah, we don't usually think about full tears repairing. Like, that's just not
No,
it's not really been in the lexicon or in the thought process. So that's just interesting and kind of encouraging. And, I've known more than one, dancer, for example, who have not repaired their ACLs, mostly because this was, years ago when ACL surgery was not great. And oftentimes after repair, they would lose range of motion and other kinds of things that are really important to their activity. Now, those people who took that path, especially as a professional dancer, worked their behinds off in terms of strength. I mean, they were in the studio 2 hours a day, every day for the rest of their career, honestly, most of them.
yep,
But they were able to manage that, and in that case through muscular strength. But I do wonder, since we don't know,
we don't know.
whether they also managed through rehabilitation and stimulation to regrow that area, at least
Yep.
to some extent, and create more stability just from that. So that's really interesting.
And you mentioned something, we talked about this very briefly before we started recording this morning, about creating a scaffolding fascially,
Mhm.
basically, of the connective
Yeah,
tissue. Now,
yeah.
anytime you have a ligament, you're gonna usually have an artery that's piggybacks it. That's how I've always learned it, that you're gonna have something that sort of piggybacks it. And when we see an ACL rupture, what normally happens is we see a lot of inflammation immediately, because you hear the pop, you hear the snap. The first thing in the ER or where your doctor's going to do is want to draw blood, or is going to want to draw fluid out of the knee and look to see if there's blood in there. Because if there is, there's a great likelihood that both the artery and the ligament have ruptured.
Mhm.
I Is there a possibility that some structural anomaly has happened, that maybe some, like you were saying, some scaffolding is growing back, or that there's a healing process that occurs? I don't know. It was interesting how you described that.
Well, when you look at, I'm thinking of Jean-Claude Guimberteau, who's a French orthopedic
Mm,
surgeon, and he has this wonderful, wonderful video. I think you can find it on YouTube called "Strolling Under the Skin," and he
wonderful.
shows it's really great. But one of the key things I'm thinking of this is I'm talking as I'm thinking. I'm thinking as I'm talking. So see how this goes. But basically, one of the images that he uses there, which is really cool, is looking at how there's this very fractal, kind of three-dimensional fibrous structure between, let's say, the ligaments and the tendon, or the ligaments and the vessels, blood vessels, and the nerves. All those things are kind of in this tissue that has a lot of mobility to it, because as I'm moving, like if my blood vessels can't stretch and move as I move my arm, I'm going to be popping them. Right? That makes sense, right? I don't want to snap them. And they're going to be shorter, they're going to be kind of crunched up here and elongated here. So I'm just moving my arms to show that. So when you think about that and you think about this complex collagenous structure that encases all of these structures and allows them to glide around each other and accommodate for changes in length, you have a collagen matrix there already,
Mhm.
which is just interesting. I hadn't thought about that till this moment, but if that collagen matrix then becomes the matrix that can rebuild, scaffolding that you can rebuild the ligament on, that's, I'm making stuff up here, people. Let's be really clear on that. But it makes sense when I look at that model of how the collagen fibers work around those structures, that you could then use that as a scaffolding to regrow the connection between point A and point B.
And the thing that I was thinking about is we talked about this before, everybody's variable. Every human
Yeah.
being has
Yep. We're
a
all different.
different amount. We're all different. Okay. So if I tore my ACL, you tore yours, mine may be completely away from each other. They may, I mean, never shall the two meet again without surgical. And others may be like this. They're
Little fringy,
mostly little
yeah, little
fringy kind of
fringy bits that are close to each other, close enough to bridge that gap, like we do with
right.
every time we, like, cut ourselves with a knife or anything else. What does our body do? It throws collagen at that area to bridge that gap. I mean, that's what the body does to heal any wound that we have. So presumably
So
that's something like that could be happening here as well.
it's possible. Anything's possible in this situation, which is why we wanted to introduce it and say, look, there's a possibility, which is unless you are an athlete who needs to rush back to playing their sport, and the sport involves a lot of pivoting, twisting, turning, all of that, then I think surgery is very smart. But as this article says, maybe there's not a rush necessarily to go into that. If that's not part of your sport that you need to have that, and again, this was after 2 years they saw that there was some, that it was back intact in some way, shape, or form. And again, we don't know how strong, because we both know with connective tissue, sometimes, after a tear,
Yeah.
things grow back stronger, and other
Yep.
times they're kind of
Not so
weakish.
much.
So
Yeah.
we don't even know that. There's so
No.
much more to be learned from this.
Hmm.
But it's just something that we wanted to sort of introduce as a concept, because as you've worked with people that I've worked with without an ACL, we do have to limit some of what they do just because they don't have that same amount of stability as someone who has an ACL. They're fine in the sagittal plane, but the other
Yep.
planes of motion, not as much.
Right, and they may wear a brace. I mean, there may be things that they do when they're in a vulnerable situation, just to protect themselves, whether it's a brace or whether it's just limiting their activities or whatever, depending on where that person's going back to. Now, let's
Yeah.
talk a little bit about now. I want to say one other thing. So when they compare outcomes from non-surgical and surgical repair for an ACL, Brian, you've read up on this. I've read up on this.
Yeah.
There's a lot of, like, well, if you can wait and you can manage it with exercise and rehabilitation, your outcome is not necessarily any worse than a
Yeah.
surgical intervention. So,
Yeah.
but the caveat for me on that is you have to be willing to work with your body, and you really have to be willing to create stability in other ways to, follow your rehabilitation process. If you're going to just sit there and, like, let it do whatever it's going to do, your outcomes, I don't think, are going to be as good. And in that case, you may really want to do surgery because you're not going to be willing to do the work to create that stability, musculoskeletally on your own.
Something else to think about, that if you're not willing to do the exercise, if you're not willing to really work it, and you said it with those dancers, they work their butt off. They
Yeah,
work their
it really
butt off to
did.
create the stability in the knee, and I mean, you need to do that. You need to dedicate yourself to really shoring that stability up. And one of the reasons is because for for a lot of people who have an ACL tear, especially if it was caused by a trauma or a blow. There's often some meniscal damage that often occurs with it. So
Yeah.
that gives you a
Yep.
little bit more instability.
Yep.
Sometimes the medial collateral ligament can have some damage that might lead to a little bit more instability. Now, over time, if this happens to an 18-year-old, 25-year-old, and you're a younger person, they can build up their strength and everything's fine. Well, if this person at the age of 30, 35 stops doing any exercise, by the time they get to their 50s, they could have created quite a bit of instability in that knee because, again, their primary ligament is torn and the other ligament structures are not as strong as they once were and have some damage. That could create a much more unstable knee, which can cause more meniscal damage, that can lead to other
Arthritis.
issues,
Yeah.
arthritis and
Yep.
whatnot.
Yep.
So you need to know going in that if you don't have an ACL, that you're going to be working on this. This is going to be something that is going to be a focus of every workout pretty much from now until, you do a knee replacement or you're past this earth,
Yeah.
that you're going to have to focus on this because if you don't, it can lead to things down the road. It can lead to
Mhm.
an increased instability of that knee joint. And we don't
Right.
want to see that.
No. The other thing too, though, and just to bring that up, so if you do have an ACL repair, right? There's lots of ways to do that, and Brian can talk more about that. But if you do have
Mhm.
an ACL repair, um, we say this a lot on this podcast. I'm just going to say it one more time. The surgeons will often lead you to believe that life will be normal very quickly. Right? It's like, "Oh, yeah, yeah, 2 or 3 weeks, you're gonna be driving," or whatever it is. I mean, I hear this from every single client who ever goes in for surgery. That's why I'm saying this. It's just surgeons have a view of the world that is different than the client's experience most of the time. So, to
I
put
almost did
that
a
out
spit
there.
take on that one, by the way. You caught me swallowing. I was like, "Yeah." How many times have we heard that not only from our clients, but from
Yeah,
ourselves? I went in for
absolutely.
shoulder surgery and the guy said, "Oh yeah, you're going to be back to normal, Some people end up training, a couple weeks later." And then afterwards, he says, "Oh no, 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 no. You're going to be, basically not moving that for about 8 weeks." So I was like, "Wait a minute. What? You
Right.
said." And
Yes.
again, beforehand, and I like this surgeon, and I thought, huh, maybe I heard what I wanted to hear, but I don't know about that. I'm pretty sure something came out of his mouth that I,
You listen
interpreted
pretty
correctly.
carefully. You listen pretty
I
carefully,
usually
Brian.
do.
It's not like you're an ignorant patient. You understand kinda how these things
No.
go. So, with that in mind, like, for everybody I know is that ACL surgery, it's 3 to 6 months of
Oh,
at least
minimum.
to a year, right, to a year. I always think of 3 to 6 months kinda gets you 3 months gets you somewhere. 6 months gets you to the point where, okay, you're starting to really feel like things are getting better, and then it really takes a year before you feel like, maybe, "Okay, I'm good, I'm confident, my range of motion is back," all those things. So it's a process, like,
Yeah.
and the question for me is always, how much better off would I be? Would I be better off if I just spent that year focusing on rehabbing this thing and didn't get the repair, or getting the
Yep.
repair and still spending a year focusing on rehabbing this thing? Right. And I
Yep.
think that's just, it's a question. And it's a question between you and your doctor and you and yourself in terms of
And
which way you
something
want to
that
go.
I always tell every client who's about to do any type of surgery, you've got a year of rehab no matter what you do. Surgery or
Yep.
not, you've got
Yep.
a year of rehab.
Yep.
So just know that going in, that you're going to
Hmm.
have to do the work. It's not the
Yep.
magic pill, it's not the cure that you're
Yep.
going to wake up and suddenly you have a brand new knee. Even for a knee replacement, it's not a brand new knee. The innards
No,
are, but you got to get it to
you got
be
to
where
work it.
you got to work it. And in an
Yeah.
ACL repair, how I always look at it is this: you're 8 weeks, 8 to 12 weeks just for the bone itself, because what they're going to do in a replacement is they're actually going to drill through the bone and they're going to put some bone plugs there to hold the new ligament in place. So just the bone itself to take time to heal is 8 to
Yeah.
12 weeks. So that's 3 months right there just for the
Yep.
bone portion,
Right.
not the trauma of the surgery, not the rehabilitation. When they say 6 months, for most people, most athletes, most people wanting to return to sports, 6 months is the absolute minimum.
Yep.
9 months is usually I just saw a baseball player. We're recording this in May, by the way. So a baseball player just tore their ACL, and we watched it, many, many times on Sports Center here one morning. They kept re-showing it. And as soon as I saw him, he planted and he twisted. You could see it happen. It was like, oh my gosh. And he said he's out for the season. And the client I was with actually said, well, why? If they do the surgery now, couldn't he come back for the postseason? And that team's not postseason material, I believe. But I said, no, it's 9 months before those tissues are really ready to train at a high level, unless you are Superman type collagen recovery. There have been a few
Mhm.
athletes who have come back after 3 to 6 months and been fine. But we're talking about the few and far between, the one of
Yeah.
1%.
Yep.
The
Yep. Yep.
average person, 3 to 9 months before you can get back to activity, 12 months before you start feeling fairly normal.
And confident with it.
That's the biggest part, is the confidence.
Yeah. And it's also the confidence, it's also, at least for a lot of clients I worked with, was getting the range of motion back.
Yeah.
That, I mean, oftentimes an ACL tear, they make that ligament kind of tight, and they make it so that you're not having a lot of movement in that knee. But sometimes that means you lose full range of motion in extension. So the knee doesn't straighten all the way. Sometimes it'll stay
Yep.
bent a little bit. And that means your gait changes. That means your foot's acting differently. That means your hips acting like that, then goes up and down the chain. Because that's the other thing, is that once you change the mechanics in any area of the body, the rest of the body
Yeah.
responds to that. And returning to like normal, whatever that is, biomechanics in that knee, really can take quite a while. So at the very least, you're limping for a while because you're like
Yep.
lightly weight bearing, or you're supported weight bearing, or your knee isn't quite straightening, or all those things are happening. So there's often a period of
Yep.
time where you're just not walking normally. And then, and even if you're strengthening and doing all your rehab, you're still not walking normally, you're not moving normally during your day. And you're working a lot harder on the other leg in all those situations. And it takes really a time for all that to get balanced back out, and to be able to walk relatively normally, and again, start to really balance the forces through the body again.
And as a practitioner that we work with the clients who have this, you need to keep something in mind. You need to find out from them what type of replacement they had.
Yeah.
Okay. And the reason I say, and when I say replacement, it's really, ACL repair. If they had a patella tendon, where they take the middle third of the patella tendon and use that, they've had to slice through a lot more of the anterior portion of the knee in order to get the tendon out. That person is going to have a lot more restriction in range of motion. That one is going to take quite a while to be able to bend all the way, because they've caused trauma to the patella tendon, which affects the quadricep, obviously.
Yeah.
If they've done a hamstring graft or an allograft where they use a cadaver graft, uh, it's not as much, because they haven't caused as much trauma to the knee. So you don't see as much of a flexibility issue as you do with the patella tendon. Now, the patella tendon is the strongest, and depending on the surgeon, when I was in Phoenix, I taught a class and we talked about ACL repairs, and I happened to have 3 or 4 physical therapists in the room. And I went and I asked each one. I said, "You work with a number of physicians, and you've done a lot of ACL, rehab." I said, and I went each one. I said, "For you, what do you see more of?" And most of them said hamstring. One of them said, "We almost always only see patella."
Mm.
And I said, "Where are you?" She was at a ski town.
Oh, right,
She
because 'cause
was
they're trying
in
to
an
get them
area where
stronger.
there's a lot of skiers. So guess what?
Oh.
They wanted to use the strongest one possible, is my theory. The doctor
Yeah.
focused on that. Made sense to me. Whereas
Yeah.
some of the others were more rural, or were, seeing a mixture of them, but a lot more hamstring, especially on women. And so it's kind of like interesting that the skiers, because they require a lot more stability for their sport, for what they
Yeah,
want to do,
absolutely.
they use the stronger. So it's just something to keep in mind. Not that the hamstring is a lot weaker, but they say that immediately after surgery, the patella tendon graft is going to be 125% as strong as the original. Now,
Yeah.
again, that's day one. Over time, there's going to be some stretching and all of that, but we're just saying day one, that's what they measure. It's measured at. The hamstring is about 90% as strong, which is still plenty, still plenty. And the allograft, I haven't heard any numbers on that, but it's got to be plenty strong. So whichever they choose, we just need to know as the instructor what we may need to work on. If someone comes in and they say they had the patella, I want to make sure that they're going to have as much knee flexion on both legs to try to get them as close as possible on both sides, because that flexibility can make a difference, especially when you're out on a field.
Mhm. Absolutely. So when
You
I
know,
think about, I think about just exercises for my post rehab, my post surgical ACL people. First of all, some of that, depending on the circumstance, and with the American healthcare system, who knows what's going to happen. But
yep,
oftentimes they're with a physical therapist for like 4 to 8 weeks often, and you may not be seeing them in that initial phase. That's good because you kind of want
yes,
somebody who can do a lot of manual work, who can get that range of motion back, who can really keep things going. Once you
yep,
start to work with them, which is typically like the 8 to 12 week mark, has been my experience, although again,
yep,
St. Francis would often work with dancers much sooner than that. Um, and at that point, it's like I'm working on basic quad and hamstring strength for sure, and hamstring strength, like we talked about, even though that repair is in place. And I start with that. I make sure that they're not swelling too much afterwards, right? I try to figure out what's tolerable and slowly and
yep,
progressively build that up, try not to cause irritation. Once that's pretty stable and feels like I can get decent resistance on that, then I really start to add in lateral work, right? Even if it's very simple, even
mhm,
if it's just like, for example, on the reformer, side legs, standing leg springs, right? Just standing legs going
yep.
in and out with a light spring, just to get that movement in that lateral position and then changing with parallel, turned out, etc. Because I want to get them stable in those unexpected planes, right? I want to make sure they're
Yes.
not just working sagittally, but they start to get, when they're stable and comfortable, when they start to get comfortable in those other ranges. That's kind of where I like to work a lot.
I love focusing on the
Mhm.
gluteus medius. To me, that is the unsung hero of the knee. That is a primary stabilizer of the knee.
Yep.
Even though it's so far away, it stabilizes it because it is partially responsible for the tracking of that femur, keeping it straight and not internally rotating, making sure that it's moving properly. So
Yeah.
the gluteus medius, you need to work. And like you said, if all they do is train in the gym sagittally and then they try and go out and play soccer or ultimate or whatever their sport may be, volleyball, whatever, and they're moving side to side, they're moving in rotation, they're twisting, turning, all of that. If they haven't trained for that, then you're doing them a disservice and they're
Absolutely.
going to have issues. They're going to have
Yep.
issues.
Yep.
And that I find is one of the things that we talked about a second ago that I find is the hardest thing to work with some of these clients is getting their confidence level back. Because
Hmm.
if they don't have confidence, they are always worried that their knee is going to go out on them. So they
Yep.
baby it, they favor it, and that
Yep.
can lead to not trusting it.
Yep.
But if you're training them in a way that they're doing that pivoting, twisting, and hitting it from all angles, it does help to boost their confidence at least a little bit that they're training in all of those. So they're moving side to side, they're doing side shuffles, they're hopping on one foot side to side, they're doing skaters, they're doing all sorts of things that are leading them back to, oh, yeah, this feels more like what I'd be doing out there on the field.
Exactly.
And that can lead to increased confidence, and that's what you want. You want them to
Yep.
be able to trust that knee, because if
Yep.
not, they're never gonna be 100%. I find
Yep.
that up here will limit them a lot more than the actual knee itself,
Exactly. And
you
that's where I
know?
do a lot of work unilaterally also. So even
Oh,
on like
yeah.
footwork, post-surgery, if it's when it's appropriate, I'll do a lot of single leg work. Like I might just work
Yes.
that leg because oftentimes, as we've talked about before with immobility or with not doing much, they can lose so much strength in that area between the trauma and, not working as much, that I really want to get that side just up, just like get it up, wake it up, whatever they can tolerate. I do a lot of unilateral work, ton of unilateral work,
Yes.
try to get that area back closer to the other leg. And that really can help too.
I find in general, whenever I'm doing rehabilitation work with someone post-rehab work on lower body, unilateral is the one thing that I focus on the most, is
Yep.
because I wanna make sure that I am shoring that up. But I do both sides. I won't just do the one side. I want to
Yeah.
strengthen both because we need to make sure they're both strong and we need to make sure they're balanced. But it also gives me an indication of when I've come close. I look for about a less than a 5% difference. So that could be
Hmm.
in reps, weights, intensity, whatever I decide to choose. You want to look at getting them within that 5% range, because then if I just took the average person off the street, they're probably going to have about a 5% difference between their right and their left. Everybody has
At
one side that's
least,
more
at
stronger.
least.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So if I can get them back to 5%, I know this person's ready and they're going to be able to do whatever they ask that knee to do.
So, and in the Pilates environment, I typically do 2 things. One, when I'm first starting with a client post rehab like that, I'll do 2 legs first. Then I'll often do unilateral on the better side, the uninjured side, because what I want them to do is just neurologically pattern what that feels like. Then I'll
Sure.
do the
Yep.
injured side. I'll do that for a while. Then I'll start to do injured side, not injured side. And I'll just do an extra
I
rep,
like
an
that.
extra set on those. It's a really nice, easy way to do that.
Mhm,
But a lot of times I'm trying to just put that old that old motor pattern
mhm.
back in their body from the leg that isn't injured and kind of how that moves and how that feels. Because you'll often see like one leg's, the uninjured leg's going great, the left leg comes up and it doesn't know what to do, right? It rolls
Yep.
out, it rolls in, it like the knee wobbles around, like it's just not sure how to find that pattern again.
I like that. I like that a lot. Now, I do want to talk about contraindications too,
Yep.
because there's one primary contraindication, and we call it open terminal chain knee extension. Open chain terminal knee extension. That's the proper phrasing. And what that basically means is if anybody's done a leg extension machine where you're sort of sitting on a machine and you're extending your leg out, there's no connection to the ground.
Right.
That's
And
open
you've got
chain.
on top of your ankle, right? Like a lot of times you've
Right.
got like a bar in front of your ankle and you're lifting that up. And it
Or
pushes you
even a
into
leg weight.
hyperextension. Yeah, right,
Right.
exactly. Yep.
Exactly. And what they showed on a strength graph is that the shear force in the knee, as the leg is going up, as it approaches 45 degrees, the shear force doesn't change that much. Past 45 degrees, it starts to increase. And that last 30 degrees, there's a ton of shear force on the knee. And can you imagine when when your leg is perfectly straight and you have a weight distal down by your ankle, pushing down toward the ground, and your quadricep is trying to pull that up? You're basically pulling that tibia forward. You're basically taking that and trying to drive that tibia forward, stretching out that ligament. And that's what we want to avoid. So, closed chain activities are always, in my opinion, going to be best in general for rehabilitation. I like closed
Yep.
chain activities where our feet are on the
Yep.
ground because that's where we live. But especially for this, you want to keep them off the leg extension machine. You want to keep them off of anything open chain. Work them closed chain terminal knee extension. There's a ton of different exercises online that you can do. I do one with a band. Usually I give that for homework where I tie a band around a banister or something and put the other end behind the knee and just have them work from a bent knee to straight knee, bent knee to straight knee, and that last 30 degrees. And I have them do it for time. I'll have them do it for a minute, 2 minutes, because this is a muscle that's going to get that vastus medialis firing a little bit stronger, for the range of motion. And it's a great way that I can give them homework to do that they can do, and it's easy. They can't say they can't do it.
Right. And one precaution specifically for the Pilates environment is feet in straps, which is kind of
Mm.
semi-open chain or whatever you want to talk about it. But I'm really cautious with that. And I basically have people, if they're going to do that, they keep the knees bent the whole time.
Yeah.
So they really maintain just a slight knee flexion. So they may be going up and down or doing circles or whatever, but I will, again, first I'll have the strap above the knee so that they're not even using the lower leg and that can do whatever it's and just work the hips. But then when they go into actually having the strap at their feet, I'll really work on not going into that hyperextension at all. Same thing even with footwork on the reformer, because again, you're just the fact that you're lying down and you straighten your legs, you'll see the clients kind of drop back into that hyperextension or just
Yes.
sort of let the legs kind of, I call it the thunk, the like little clunk at the end where everything just snaps
Yes.
back. I have them avoid that. So we really stay, okay, don't go any farther back than that. Don't go any farther back than this, right? And I'll almost keep my foot sometimes even, or my hand on the top of the reformer behind the shoulder rest. So they can't go any farther back and can't get to that point where they just lock out the knee and go into essentially ligament support. I want to keep the muscular
Yep.
support through the whole action. However I can do that on whatever machine I'm working on is really keeping that piece going.
Yeah. I love that. I love that. And I was just wondering about that when you said feet and straps. I was like, huh. different exercises. My brain is going to all the different, variations, the frog squat, squatting in that position. But I'm thinking, yeah, that made a whole lot of sense. And especially if you're doing, straight leg hamstring, you know,
Yeah.
in that
Yeah.
position,
Just
you're really
yeah.
providing a lot of, if your knees are locked out, oh my gosh. But as soon as you bend your knees, those hamstrings begin to take up some of that strength and some of that
They're doing the job.
stability. That's wonderful. That's a great idea. That's a really good idea.
Yeah.
Good. So we got only a couple more minutes here. I want to sort of review just a little bit of what we want to focus on with the clients when they do come to us, what we have to do. When they
Mhm.
first come, should be about 12 weeks out from surgery. Listen to the physical therapist, do whatever they want you to do. We want to avoid that open chain terminal knee extension, focus on closed chain activities, right?
Mhm.
Work three-dimensionally, work in all planes of motion, side to side, rotation, everything as long as their physical therapist is given the green light to do so, or their physician is given the green light.
And I'm gonna just step that back a minute. So like I start sagittal, start
Oh,
bilateral, and
sure.
then I go to sagittal unilateral, and then I go to three-dimensional just as
Yeah,
a progression through making sure they tolerate each of those steps.
absolutely. You want to make sure that they are making those steps. You don't want to jump into something way too difficult right from the get-go. And again,
Right.
the doctor and physical therapist is going to give you some good indication of what they're capable of. Because I've had
Yeah.
some people 12 weeks out, the PT tells me anything, nail them, they're fine, train them hard. And I've had others who say, okay, this person, we really want to just focus on hip extension for a little while. We
Yep.
just want to focus on, their hamstrings for another 6 weeks or so. And then we'll start to, so it all
Yeah.
depends on the individual. So
Yep.
by the time they get to
Absolutely.
you, having the PT or the doctor give you the green light on what to do will help. And then if you have any questions, get their email address, email them and just say, they've progressed here sagittally. They're doing their side lying leg raises. They've been doing all of their glute med work. I'd like to start them with closed chain glute med work. I'd like to start them with this or that. If you get the thumbs up, even better. Even better. That takes the responsibility purely off of you and gives you someone else who's looked at their body and be able to agree with you and say, yes, now's the time to do that.
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. Cool. So anterior cruciate ligament issues. Hopefully
Yeah.
this has been helpful to you. There's a lot of things we've talked about, both for people who just have tears, a little bit of prevention, a little
Yep.
bit of post-surgery, some conjecture time, some theory based on some new ideas.
Yep.
So thank you guys for joining us.
Yeah. Thank you. We always appreciate every listener we have. We also really appreciate every like, every comment. Comments are really important to boost us up in people's feeds. Like, subscribe, get the podcast as soon as it drops every week on Tuesday. If you like what we're doing, please let us know. If you have any questions or comments, our Gmail account's the best way to get in touch with us. Movingconvos@gmail.com is the best way. We do respond through Instagram, but not as quickly. The email, I will say, we will respond a lot faster. So, hope you guys learned a lot. I know it always inspires me every time we have a conversation like this and I get to pick Nora's brain a little bit. So, hopefully, you guys learned a lot too. And for Nora St. John, I'm Brian Ritchie. We will see you next week.
Bye, guys.